So why am I doing a boring lecture on Friday night? It's because A, it's boring, and B, this piece just has so much that needs explaining. Musically, very difficult, very dissonant, and Charles Ives himself really wanted people to get it. He really wanted people to understand it. And he went so far as to even publish a book of essays to go along with the music, kind of laying out his ideas. So to kind of start, how did I become acquainted with this piece? I discovered it in high school, just randomly picked a CD from the classical section at the library. First time I listened to it, I did not know what to make of it, and I kept listening and realized, oh, this might be a masterpiece, especially after following the score, which I don't know how many musicians here like to follow scores. It's a very nerdy thing to do, but it helps with more difficult music like this. And so I realized somewhere down the road that I was going to have to engage with it on a high level, and for me that meant learning it, studying it, and that's the journey I've been on for the last 10 years. So Charles Ives himself was a very unique figure in American music. He had this sort of untraditional musical upbringing because his father was the town band leader in the town of Danbury, Connecticut. Very experimental musical sense, and he really embraced dissonance. And he would do things like march two bands toward each other, playing different music, and just listen to the chaos that resulted. Or he would accompany Charles singing one hymn in one key, while Charles sang in a different key, stuff like that. And there's also a great anecdote where Charles and his father were walking through New York City, and there was a homeless man singing on a corner, you know, in sort of a broken voice. And his father said, now listen closely, but don't listen too closely to the sounds or you might miss the music. So he had this real sense of like what music was meant to represent. And it was more than just note accuracy, you know, that like what classical establishment might admire or value, but just this overall sense of what is the music communicating, what experience is it tapping into. And that quote is kind of profound because it comes full circle where Charles Ives made some recordings late in his life, playing fragments from the Concord Sonata and some other music, but he also played and sang this sort of patriotic song that he had written, and you hear his voice straining, and so the idea comes full circle, because like what he's expressing is, you know, bigger than the actual accuracy of the notes. Anyway, so Ives, Charles Ives, in addition to those weird experiments from his father, he did learn piano, he learned organ, he was a composition major at Yale, and he did fine at Yale, but he soon realized that these ideas that he got from his father, and this sort of taste for dissonance, was not going to be accepted as the mainstream. The music he wanted to write, he was going to have to do on his own and become financially independent some other way. So he went into insurance and became very successful, and that allowed him to write whatever he wanted on nights and weekends. And this also meant that he kind of stayed out of the concert scene. He really had disdain for the classical concert scene of the time. He thought that Mozart and Haydn wrote dainty little sugar plum sounds. You know, he was a really rough and tumble guy. He'd grown up playing baseball, and he liked to use sort of baseball imagery and metaphors in some of his music. And he also looked forward to the day when the school children will whistle popular tunes in quarter tones, which is probably still a bit optimistic. So many of his works just kind of sat on his desk and didn't really get noticed until later in life. And the one sort of ship that he sent out into the world was this piece, his second piano sonata. So he worked on it from about 1911 to 1915, and he really recognized its greatness immediately. He published copies of the music at his own expense and sent it out to hundreds of different musicians and people who thought might be interested. Many of them had no idea what to make of it, but interestingly, George Gershwin actually loved it and tried to get in contact with him to tell him how much he appreciated it, but they kind of missed each other. Ives was vacationing in England or something. It would have been an interesting contact. But so, the piece was finished in 1915, but didn't receive a full premiere until 1938. And so, that performance by pianist John Kirkpatrick, really kind of exploded Ives onto the scene. There was this one glowing review from the critic Lawrence Gilman. I always love reading this quote. He said, "This sonata is exceptionally great music. It is indeed the greatest music composed by an American and the most deeply and essentially American in impulse and implication. It is wide-ranging and capacious. It has passions, tenderness, humor, simplicity, and homeliness. It has imaginative and spiritual vastness. It has wisdom and beauty and profundity, and a sense of the encompassing terror and splendor of human life and human destiny, a sense of those mysteries that are both human and divine." So, can't think of much higher praise for a piece of music, and I totally agree with everything he said, and I'll explain kind of how this all relates. But yeah, it's an amazing piece of music, and it's slowly made its way into the mainstream, and dozens of pianists have performed it, including Philip Bush in Milwaukee played it in the fall. It's amazing. So, the context of this piece. The title is Concord, Massachusetts, 1840 to 1860. What he's referring to is the town that was the home of several writers and thinkers associated with the Transcendentalist movement. So Transcendentalism was the first major intellectual movement in America. It sort of became the basis for Unitarianism. And I'm not saying I endorse this or personally believe it, but the basic tenets or beliefs are that divinity pervades all nature and all humanity, therefore humans are inherently good. There's an idea of individualism and skepticism of societal institutions, and there's the sense that the individual is on this constant intellectual quest, a constant lifelong search for meaning and hints of the divine in everyday life. There's also an embrace of nature, nature being a place to sort of reset, observe the workings of the natural world, and just pull away from the constructs of human society. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was the subject of the first movement of the piece, was sort of the figurehead of this movement. I love this from his essay, Nature. He says, "In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air, and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." So very mystical, very kind of like new agey, I guess. But we'll get more to Emerson in a minute. So now that I've laid out what Transcendentalism is, the connection between the philosophy and the music in this piece is extremely deep and extremely layered. So Ives wanted to express these values, and in some cases the thought processes of these thinkers, through music, and so he used a musical language that itself was very individual and not really tethered to a system. And so you can describe his language as sort of free dissonance, but also like a free use of quotations from hymn tunes, other patriotic tunes, etc., that sort of give them new context. And the infinite possibilities of free dissonance also allow for many levels of vagueness or specificity, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. And this idea of the sort of common good of all humans, he expresses in this theme that he calls the human faith theme, which I'll play here. Like this. You only hear it a few times in that whole statement. A lot of the time, all you hear is. Sometimes you'll only hear, which is pretty amazing because it's literally just do, re, mi, but somehow like holds together this extremely complex, dissonant piece of music. And then you might have also heard the. That's everywhere. Honestly, like if you're lost in the music, just like try to pick up the Beethoven chords. So that's one of the two Beethoven quotes. The other one. So this is a little more abstract, but it sounds a little bit like the beginning of Beethoven. difficult sonata, and here Ives is presenting the American answer, and also kind of giving a shout out to Beethoven. So just to show you like the range of expression in this piece, so I played that human faith theme. So a couple ways that it's stated. So in the Emerson movement, you hear it like. So there's one statement of it. Then in Hawthorne, you hear these like flighty things. There's a really dissonant kind of octave displacement one at the end. It's like you can still sort of hear it in there. Then in the Alcotts movement, you hear these nice, harmonized, nostalgic. Let's see. Getting more like homey. And then in Thoreau, we get way far out and mystical. So the theme is threaded through all four movements to show this common idea threaded between all these figures. So there's this constant contrast between complexity and simplicity, this idea of truths hidden and then revealed. And there's also this vagueness, like especially in the Hawthorne movement, and some of these patriotic tunes that he uses, they'll pop up in these sort of near statements that aren't quite what it is. So you lean closer, like, wait, is that it? It's like not quite right. And so it mirrors sort of the way we remember things, this sort of paradoxical way that it draws our attention to what the true form is and kind of makes our memory work. And so this is part of what's so addicting about this piece, is like you'll be playing through it and you'll like hear like a fragment of something that's not quite, like there's just always these tendrils of like all these roots of the themes kind of leading you in different paths. Okay, I'm getting way beyond myself here. So, so finishing up the philosophical part. So I wrote these essays to go along with the piece. He called this book Essays Before a Sonata. And so he has a prologue and then an essay for each movement of the piece. And in the prologue, he writes a lot about aesthetics and about programmatic music. So the difference between absolute music and programmatic. Absolute music is basically just itself. Programmatic music has some outside inspiration from art or literature or historical event. This is a programmatic piece, because each movement is about a person and the overall arching idea of transcendentalism. And so he also asks these big questions about whether specific objects or ideas can really be represented in music, which is really essential to this piece, because he's trying to portray not only scenes from American life, but also the thought process of a thinker like Emerson, which is just a really heady task. So, on a musical level, if we're thinking about what makes a sonata, traditionally a sonata would be 3 or 4 movements. You'd have an opening sort of fast movement in sonata allegro form, exposition, development, recapitulation. The Emerson movement sort of follows that. It sort of serves as our sonata form movement. And then the second movement traditionally would be like a minuet or a scherzo or joke. The Hawthorne movement sort of serves as a scherzo. It's really wild and wacky. And then the third movement, the Alcotts, is sort of our tender, slow movement. And then the weird thing is, there would usually be a fast finale in the sonata, but Thoreau is sort of an anticlimax. It's very slow, very quiet, very meditative. So the sonata breaks a lot of rules. Other rules it breaks, there's an optional flute part and an optional viola part. So it sort of takes it out of the realm of solo piano music entirely. There's also a block of wood that you are supposed to play clusters with. custom made, like the exact clusters you have to play. So I kind of love that individual touch, like no other piece uses this. And you have to make it yourself, just sort of like this Yankee ingenuity. So the other thing is, so Ives, as I mentioned, hated the classical establishment. He had so much disdain for like mainstream classical music, and so he writes in some of his performance notes, like, there are many passages not to be played too evenly. A metronome could not measure Emerson's mind and oversoul any more than the old Concord steeple bell could. So he's, once again, connecting the music to the philosophy. It's like, you know what, like, as the spirit leads, just, you know, and also in the Hawthorne movement, he says there are many passages not to be, or like, don't take this too literally, even as he's writing like extremely dense, complex music. So probably part of the reason I've stuck with this piece is because he kind of allows you to make mistakes. You're always going to be struggling. It's very hard to get all the notes unless you're Marc-Andre Hamelin. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the individual movements. So Emerson. Emerson, as I said, was sort of the figurehead, the leader of the Transcendentalist movement. Ives held him in very high regard. Again, something else he probably got from his father. I think his father probably had heard Emerson speak, or at least was living more around the time that Transcendentalism was taking off. And Emerson was known as a very captivating speaker. He'd have these town meetings where he'd be kind of hurling these mystical pronouncements. And maybe they made sense, maybe they didn't, and he'd kind of have to backtrack to make them make sense. But people loved hearing him speak. And so the music kind of depicts this thought process where it starts out in this tangled web of ideas, and then they slowly work themselves out. And you know, Ives describes him as a mountain guide so intensely on the lookout for the trail of his star that he has no time to stop and retrace his footprints. So I think you'll definitely hear that in the music. And so some other themes that are introduced in this first movement. There's this theme that I guess we can call the Emerson theme. It kind of shows his strength of character. It's just a little fragment. But of course, the first time you hear it, it's very bold, very dissonant. And then there's this pastoral sort of theme. And then, of course, the human faith theme that I played before. So that's Emerson. Now, Hawthorne, the weird thing about Hawthorne is that he was sort of a critic of the Transcendentalist movement, and most of his stories are more about morality and guilt. And so what Ives does in this movement is he kind of just like flips back and forth between all these images from different short stories. It's kind of hard to describe them all, but the predominant one is called The Celestial Railroad. Is anyone familiar with that story? So there's the Pilgrim's Progress, right? Old sort of allegory for Christian life. It's about this pilgrim sort of having to go through trials and tribulations to get to the celestial city. Well, the Celestial Railroad is sort of this satirical piece where these Christians have discovered this train that takes them like on a fast track to the celestial city, so they skip all the hard parts. And so you hear this sort of like chugging train, and sort of the frivolousness of the passengers on board. And then there are a couple parts where everything comes to a halt and you hear these distant like hymn tunes, which is sort of supposed to represent, like they see these pilgrims still walking their dedicated walk. And then the train just keeps moving on. It's really interesting. And there's sort of a meta quality about that because you can take that as like the Celestial Railroad story or more as a general picture of society as like the conflict and contrast between the secular and like the religious. And so then he also tries to bring in ragtime and patriotic tunes, especially this one called Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean. And that becomes subject to like this weird sort of fantasia that eventually just spirals out of this vortex of doom. It's really, really wild. So I've always wondered what he's trying to say in this movement. But I think it's really just this tableau of American life in the 1840s and 60s, this collision between like patriotic marches and the church and like ragtime bars. And I guess ragtime wasn't invented, but either way, it's wild. And this is the type of movement that Ives turns to again in later pieces, like his Fourth Symphony, where he has a movement called Comedy that uses some of the same material. And once again, it's showing this sort of wild, wacky sense of people's preoccupations and not stepping aside to kind of think deeper about meaning. So then the Alcotts. So first of all, who saw the new Little Women movie? Really good, right? Yeah. Or have you read the book Little Women? Either way. So this movement is about not just Louisa May Alcott, but about her father, Bronson Alcott. Bronson was a teacher, and he was known as sort of a serene, quiet man, but had this real like courage and moral character. There's some anecdotes about during some trials for fugitive slaves, he sort of led these charges, these protests, and in one case he was the only one to stand his ground when gunshots were heard. So a very noble man. And he brought his family to start this commune called Fruitlands in rural Massachusetts. It's kind of amazing to think about this. So they based the commune on transcendental ideas. They had self-sufficient farming, they had a vegan diet, they wore simple linen clothing. It only lasted 7 months because they had difficulty farming. But after that they moved to Concord, Massachusetts, in this home that they called Orchard House, which you can still tour, it still exists. And so in this movement, I started depicting the simplicity and sort of the home virtues of New England life. He talks about the strength of hope that never gives way to despair. And he's also depicting like Beth from Little Women, who played the piano, and also by connection, Louisa May's sister Lizzie, who might have been the inspiration for Beth. And he talks about her playing at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony on the spinet piano. So in the 19th century, a lot of the way that you encounter classical music was through piano reductions of symphonies and other concert music. So people might have had, for example, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony arrive in like a piano score and kind of play through it to get a sense of the music that way, if they could go to the concert. And so you'll hear at the beginning of the movement, increasingly agitated Beethoven quotes that just kind of like trying to pound it out. And it's really poignant because there's this ongoing connection to Beethoven. You think Beethoven worked with such simple motives, but he stormed the heavens with them. And something like Ode to Joy, it's like the first thing you might play on any instrument. It's like a very simple tune, but what it represents is this sublime masterpiece about like the brotherhood of man. And so it's like the beginning of the musical journey, but then like when they reach their peak, they might actually play the Ninth Symphony. So that's really interesting. And then Ives also includes these sort of Scottish ballads, these very nostalgic songs, like kind of parlor music that the Alcott family might have sung together at night at home. You hear distant tolling church bells. And then at the end, it kind of works itself up and gives way to this grand, like C major statement of the human faith theme. Just harmonized in the most like tearjerker way. And this is where Ives really makes a case for his musical language, because he was so annoyed with sort of the easy resolutions and conservative musical aesthetic of his time. And here he's trying to say, like, this is when you get your C major resolution after all this struggle and conflict. It's like it really feels like a homecoming. and it really just makes a deep impact. And one thing that's like super bold that he does too is like that climax what makes it a satisfying ending to the piece, but it's not the end because he has more to say. Because the whole idea of transcendentalism is we're still on a journey. So then we go way out to Thoreau, way out into the woods. So Thoreau, of course, wrote the book Walden, which is a lot of his thoughts about nature and about this sort of experiment in rustic living. You know, he built a cabin on Walden Pond and just retreated to nature to see what he could learn. And so the opening of that movement is sort of this image of mist and haze over the pond. So very like quiet and mystical. And there's sort of a narrative here. Well, first of all, so one thing that really I love about Ives is that I feel a personal connection because I grew up in Connecticut, very close to where Ives himself actually grew up. And so I sort of know those New England woods. And these woods are full of these winding trails and weird swamps and caves and all kinds of like weird twisted branches and remnants of stone walls that date back to colonial times or earlier. And there's also a real sense of peace and stillness because these are just very old woods. There's a sense of connections with generations from hundreds of years ago. But so there's this narrative that Ives describes in his program note about sort of a man or individual walking through the woods and then soon getting caught up in the thoughts of the day and feeling like, oh, you know, this is a waste of time. I should be out doing such and such. And then the woods kind of say, no, slow down, find the pace of nature, you know. And he kind of goes through that cycle a couple times. And there's this walking theme. Introspective. And one thing I love about this movement too is he's used this sort of statement of nature being the finale, nature being the arrival point. He did this in his second string quartet, where he has first movement called discussions, second movement called arguments, where the string players are supposed to represent sort of different characters talking. And after the arguments get too heated, the third movement depicts them going up to the top of a mountain to sort of view the firmament and kind of just say, ah, and, you know, sort of let off steam. It's like nature kind of cleanses the palate. And this also mirrors the progression of his fourth symphony. I mentioned the comedy movement, and then there's this finale that like drifts out into the cosmos. So Ives just really has these yearnings to express the inexpressible, to get at the very basic meaning of life, which I think is really amazing, and it's part of what gives this piece its longevity and why it's worthy to be studied still today. So, I know that was kind of rambling, but any questions at this point before we take a break? No? We're good? All right, then we're going to take a break, and then I will play it. Cling to Beethoven. And I'll play out that human faith theme one more time. That's the one you hear most. And then the movement timings. Emerson's about 50 15, Hawthorne's about 11, Alcotts 6, and then Thoreau is like 10 or 11. Here we go.